Our objectives for today are to be able to define non-communicable diseases. So you'll need to be able to give me a definition for what that is. You'll be able to list and describe some of the factors that can cause non-communicable diseases. And since we're going to discover that one of those factors is genetics, we're also going to need to be able to explain how genetic information is passed from your parents to yourself. Those would be our objectives for today. Let's start by talking about non-communicable diseases. So our definition of a non-communicable disease is that it's a disease that cannot be passed from organism to organism. So like communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases disrupt your body's ability to maintain homeostasis. But unlike communicable diseases, I cannot give you a non-communicable disease that I have. Okay, so I can't cough on you and spread this disease. And that's because non-communicable diseases are not caused by pathogens. Instead, they have a bunch of different things that can cause them. And some of those things are lifestyle factors, so things that you do and or don't do in your life. Substances that exist in your environment. So notice I say substances and not organisms because pathogens are living things. Okay, so if your disease is caused by a pathogen, it's going to be communicable. But a substance in your environment isn't something you can pass on to somebody else. And then finally, genetics. So we haven't touched on genetics much this year, but hopefully in your previous science content, you know genetics is discussing your DNA that's passed down to you from your parents. So when we say genetics is a factor, we mean that if your parents had a disease and it was coded into their DNA, then they may pass that on to you. And of course, sometimes diseases are caused by a combination of these factors. So there can be some diseases that can be coded into your DNA, but that are also exacerbated by factors in your environment. There are some diseases that you can get genetically that you can also have lifestyle factors that put you at risk for. There are some lifestyle factors and some things in your environment that might put you at risk for things. So sometimes a non-communicable disease is caused by more than one of these things, or sometimes all three of these things combined. Okay, so I don't want you to think that just because I list a disease under lifestyle factors that it can't also be genetic or it can't also be caused by something in the environment. We'll talk about that as we get to each sort of disease that we're going to talk about today. Lifestyle factors is the first thing we're going to talk about. When I talk about lifestyle factors, I'm talking about things that you have as habits in your life. They can be a lack of a good habit, or they can be the presence of a bad habit, but lifestyle factors can have an effect on your health. For example, eating fruits and vegetables is a good habit versus if you have a diet that's high in salt and fats, then that could be considered a bad habit. Both of those lifestyle factors affect the likelihood of you getting a disease. Smoking, using tobacco and or drinking, those would be lifestyle factors that could increase the chances of you getting certain diseases. Getting enough sleep, or on the other side, not getting enough sleep, could have an effect on your life. Exercising or not exercising, we're starting to get the picture. These are things that you do in your everyday life or choose not to do that can affect your health. So let's look at some of the different types of diseases that can be caused by these lifestyle factors, okay? Heart disease. Heart disease is caused often by diets that are high in fat, sometimes by a lack of exercise, and also sometimes you are genetically predisposed to heart disease. So, like I said, can be a combination of different things. Heart disease happens when plaques build up in your arteries. these deposits of these fats build up in your arteries, and they start to close off your arteries. And sometimes they can break free and get pushed down into smaller extremities and cut off blood supply. Sometimes they can close so completely they cut off blood supply closer up. And then what happens is when that blood supply is cut off, it causes the tissues that is past the plaque to start to die because they aren't getting blood. Okay? And some effects of this is if the thing that is not getting blood is your heart, if your heart is not getting the right blood supply, or if it is having to pump too hard because of these plaques, then it can cause a heart attack. And if the plaque blocks blood flow to your brain and starts causing brain tissue to die, we call that a stroke. So both heart attacks and strokes are a result of heart disease. And heart disease, I believe, is still ranked as the #1 killer in the United States. It's the thing you're most likely to die from, and it's largely preventable. Okay? It's not caused by a pathogen, it's caused by lifestyle. Even some people who are born with a tendency, like a predisposition to get heart disease, can take lifestyle action to avoid getting it to a point where it causes them damage. Also, lung disease. There's a whole range of lung diseases, but the thing I want to highlight for you most importantly is that both smoking and vaping can lead to chronic lung diseases. A lot of people seem to think that vaping is fine because you're just inhaling water, but unfortunately, if you are using a vape that has any other substance in it, you are definitely not inhaling just water. And anytime you put anything into your lungs other than air, even water vapor, it's not great for your lungs. So smoking, obviously bad for you. We've learned that for a long time. But I'm here to tell you today, vaping, also bad for you. Bad for your lungs, bad nicotine usage from tobacco can cause a whole host of problems in your body, not just lung issues. So just a reminder, not a good idea. Also, cancers. Some cancers, not all cancers, can be caused by lifestyle choices. Okay, the one thing I want you to remember is that not all of these diseases can fit neatly into one category. It's like, oh, this is always a lifestyle thing that causes this. Oh, it's always genetics that causes this. Okay, so there are some cancers that can stem from choices and lifestyle decisions that you make, and then some cancers that you're genetically predisposed to, and some cancers that are just caused by things in your environment. So cancers are groups of cells that grow out of control. So for whatever reason, the mechanism in the cell that tells it when to grow and when to stop growing stops working, and those cells grow and divide out of control, and they start to form a mass. And that mass does a couple of things. One, it damages the surrounding body tissues. Okay, so if you have a mass in your lung, it's going to damage lung tissue. And then it's also taking energy away from the cells in your body that are supposed to be doing their jobs. So now they're not getting energy, so it weakens you that way too. Okay. Things like tobacco, poor diet, lack of exercise, not using sunscreen, all of those things would be lifestyle factors that can result in cancer. So just something to remember, that we do have some control over how we treat our body, and that can help us or harm us in the long run. All right, now let's talk about environmental factors. These are non-living things that exist in your environment that can affect your health, and oftentimes these things in your environment could be similar to pathogens in the fact that they're small or that you don't see them, but the thing that they don't have in common is that they're not alive. These are non-living things in your environment, right? Some examples: pollution. So air pollution can contribute to lung disease as well as asthma and allergies. So those are, again, non-communicable diseases that are harming your body, and pollution can contribute to those. Carcinogens So there are substances called carcinogens that have been shown to cause cancer in laboratory animals. Okay, some of these substances have been found to cause cancer in humans, and some of them have not. So I want you to keep in mind that not every label on something that says it is a carcinogen is been 100% proven to be a carcinogen in people. In fact, you'll find a lot of things labeled that specifically in the state of California they have been shown to cause cancer, and that's because California has really rigorous standards of what they want the public to know about something. So if there's even a chance that in a laboratory setting it was shown to cause cancer in even a very small amount of animals, they want that labeled. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to cause cancer in you, but they like to show an abundance of caution. There are, of course, some products that will be labeled as known carcinogens, like we know for sure this causes cancer in people. And so then obviously they're going to be restricted whether or not you can be exposed to that. Okay. And then the sun. The sun is something that has been linked to causing skin cancer, and this is known to be true. If you spend excessive amounts of time in the sun without any protection, whether that be shade from a hat or clothing that covers your skin or some kind of sunblock, your chances of developing skin cancer skyrocket. Okay? Because the sun can damage your skin and cause anytime cells get damaged, they have a risk of going cancerous. So just something to keep in mind. I would recommend limit your time in direct sunlight without protective clothing or products. Okay? Skin cancer is one of the most common types of cancer in humans because we obviously can't avoid being exposed to the sun, and we haven't always been the most careful about how we protect ourselves from it. And lastly, let's talk about hereditary. So when you hear me say hereditary, it's another way to know that I'm talking about genetics. Hereditary factors are things passed to us from our parents. So when you were conceived, you received 50% of your DNA from your mom and 50% of your DNA from your dad, okay? And that DNA that you got from both of them is literally the instructions that your body uses to know how to run how to run things in your body. How to build things, how to make proteins, how to build cells. All of that stuff is coded in your DNA. And what happens is sometimes mistakes are made in those instructions when it's copied to get passed on to you. And sometimes those mistakes don't cause any problems, and sometimes they do cause problems, and you develop a disease as a result of those mistakes. So some forms of cancer happen because your DNA was copied incorrectly, and there's errors in the things that prevent cells from becoming cancerous and just copying themselves out of control. So some forms of cancer you are predisposed to, they may have been passed down to you from your parents. Not all types of cancer, but some types. Okay? Some examples of things that can be passed genetically are cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a disease that causes your lungs and your digestive tract to produce thick mucuses. This makes breathing difficult. I don't know why that says drinking. Cross out drinking, it should say breathing. I must have made a typo and it autocorrected to something wrong. So it makes breathing and digestion difficult. Okay? So this thick mucus that forms in your lungs, your body can't cough it up, so it makes breathing difficult. The thick mucus that coats your digestive tract means things don't break down the way they should, and oftentimes people with cystic fibrosis become deficient in certain minerals because they can't digest their food correctly. So there are things that we can do now that we know what cystic fibrosis is to help people with it, but it's still a fatal disease. Another example is hemophilia. Hemophilia is a disease wherein your blood does not clot properly, which means anytime you get a cut or a bruise or an injury that involves bleeding, then the blood doesn't clot properly and you can lose a lot of blood that way. And then the last one we'll talk about is sickle cell anemia. This is a disease that causes blood cells, your red blood cells, to become crescent shaped, kind of like a crescent moon shape. And the problem with that is that then they're not able to carry as much oxygen as they would be able to if they were normally shaped, and so it can cause some problems. Particularly people with sickle cell anemia have problems at high altitudes where the air is thinner and there's not as much oxygen, but they can have problems all around. And all of these diseases are ones that are passed to you from your parents. Having a parent that has a specific disease doesn't always guarantee that you will have it, and this is because of how genetic material is passed to you from your parents. So traits like having cystic fibrosis are determined by genes, and you have 2 copies of every gene. We call those copies alleles. Okay? One that you get from each parent. So you get 1 copy from each of your parents. Alleles can either be dominant, which means that they're always expressed. Okay, so if a trait for example, people often use eye color. It's not a perfect science, but in general, brown is more dominant than blue. So if you have 1 copy of the brown gene, then that one's more likely to show up because it's dominant. Okay? You can also have recessive genes that are only expressed if the dominant allele is not present. Okay? And sometimes this is how diseases work, where the gene for this disease is recessive, meaning that you won't get the disease unless you only have disease copies of the gene, recessive copies. Okay? I'll pause there actually for a sec. Okay. So let's use the example of cystic fibrosis to help us understand this, all right? For cystic fibrosis, you have to have 2 copies of the mutated, or we'll call it the bad allele, the recessive one, in order to get this disease. So it works like this. If we're going to use the capital letter F for the mutated allele, and we will use the lowercase for the normal allele. I don't know why I did it that way. It's kind of backwards, but if someone has 2 normal alleles, FF, then they won't have cystic fibrosis. Okay? So if both of their alleles are what we would consider normal or not mutated, then this person won't wind up having cystic fibrosis. Okay? And if they have 1 normal and 1 mutated one, they also won't have cystic fibrosis because they still have 1 good copy of the gene. But if they have 2 mutated alleles, then they will have cystic fibrosis because they do not have a good copy to express. Only the bad copies exist, and those are the copies that are going to be expressed, and as a result, they will have the disease. All right. In science, we use a tool called a Punnett square to see the possible combinations of alleles. Okay, Punnett squares are just drawn as basically 4 boxes, or a box that's split into 4 pieces. We're going to draw a Punnett square where we pretend that both of the parents have 1 copy of each allele, which we would call heterozygous. So when you have 1 copy of each allele, we call you heterozygous. Okay? So, the resulting possibilities are, let's draw this on here. So we're saying both mom and dad have 1 copy of each. Okay? So here's how we fill out these squares, okay? You are going to take whatever is above the square and next to the square and fill it in. So we look above, there's a capital F, and to the left, there's a capital F. So what we put in this box is capital F, capital F. Whereas when we look at this one, we have a lowercase f above and a capital F to the right. So in this box, we'll have a capital F and a lowercase f. And the same will be true of this down here because it still has a capital F above it and a lowercase f to the left.
And the capital always goes first, correct?
Yeah, I usually just write it first. I don't think it's incorrect for you to write it the other way, but we usually just write it this way. Like if you wrote it in the opposite order, I wouldn't count it wrong on a test, but I'm used to seeing it this way.
Yeah.
And then the last box, when we look above, lowercase f to the left, lowercase f. So this last box is only going to end up with lowercase f's. So, like I said, the resulting possibilities that we have from this chart, once it's all filled out, are to have two capital F's, which means it will be homozygous. Homozygous meaning both of them are the same. The prefix homo means same. And that this person who has both capital F's would have cystic fibrosis. Whereas if they wound up heterozygous, there were two boxes that were heterozygous, right? Where they had one copy of each, they would be what we call a carrier, meaning they carry the bad gene, but they won't have the disease. And then the last option they had was they had one that should be two lowercase f's, where they would be homozygous, so having the same, but they would not have cystic fibrosis because they don't have a copy of the bad gene, and they also wouldn't be a carrier, meaning they couldn't pass it on. So a lot of times when you see people who are trying to have a baby, they'll get genetic testing done to find out if they are carriers for any diseases. Okay, so for example, when I got genetic testing done when I had my daughter, I found out that I was a carrier for some blood clotting diseases. However, we also got my husband tested, and he is not a carrier, which means we didn't have to worry about our daughter having a blood clotting disease because it was only possible for her to get one copy of the gene from me, and it wasn't possible for her to get a copy from my husband because he wasn't a carrier, which means at the worst case scenario, she would be a carrier, but she would not express the disease. She wouldn't have the disease. So it's why it's not a terrible idea to get a carrier or to get tested to see if you're a carrier. And if my husband had wound up being a carrier for the disease, it's not necessarily the case that then we would have chosen not to have a child. It's just good information to have, knowing there's a possibility this could be the case when they're born, and then you get them screened and make sure that you get them treatment right away if they do have it. So just something to consider. Knowing your genetic history for diseases is a very important thing. It's a good conversation to have with your parents. Say, are there any cancers? Are there any, are we predisposed to heart disease? Are we predisposed to certain types of cancer? So that you can be aware of that. So for example, there is a gene that predisposes you to breast cancer if you have it. And so a lot of women who get screened and find out they have that gene will then go ahead and start getting mammograms sooner than they would normally recommend you get them because they know they're at a higher risk for it. The same thing for colon cancer. If you know you're at a higher risk for colon cancer, then you might start screening for it sooner than most people start screening for it because you know there's a higher risk you're going to develop it. So knowing your genetic history is a good thing. Have a conversation with your parents about it. All right, that is the end of the notes for today.